Today we're transforming a regular hem into a bubble hem on an existing garment. And you can do this on a skirt or a dress. Today I'm going to be doing this to a garment with no lining, but stay tuned till the end because I'm going to tell you how to do it with a garment that already has a lining. This is going to be a lot easier than you think. So let's start transforming your regular hems into bubbles. And before you start this project, know that the more volume you have at the hem of a skirt or a dress, the more bubble you are going to get. So definitely keep a lookout for the garments that have really full hems because you can make them bubblicious. For this project, all you need are your regular sewing supplies and a little bit of lining fabric. Before we start sewing, we need to take two measurements. We need to measure our hips, which is going to be the fullest part of your hip/butt, which is generally about 9 inches down from your natural waist. And here we've got 36 inches. So go ahead, write down your hip measurement. And now we need to figure out how much shorter do you want your dress or your skirt. When creating a bubble, it does get shorter. So we're going to measure from the waist down as long as you would like it. And I would like mine to be 16 inches. And it looks like the length of my skirt here is about 20 and a half. So I have 4.5 inches that I need to bring up the bottom of my skirt to bubble it. And when you're doing this on yourself, just make sure you have on the skirt or dress that you are bubbling so that way you get accurate measurements. If you're enjoying Sewing Anastasia, make sure you like and subscribe. It really helps out the channel a lot. And if you want to learn more about sewing, make sure you check out my online and in-person classes. There's links down below in the description. Now, let's get back to this bubble. The first thing we're going to work on is our lining. And you need to make sure your lining is bigger than your hips and longer than you want it, so that way we can size it. Your lining fabric needs to be at least 3 inches bigger than your hips. So 2 inches for ease plus a 1/2 inch on each side for seam allowance. So I have my piece of lining here and we need to cut this down. So the first thing I'm going to recommend is that you cut the width. So for the hip measurement. So I have my tape measure here and I'm going to leave mine at 40. So I'm just gonna give 1 extra inch of ease. So I can go ahead and clip everything off beyond that. And the nice thing about lining fabric, if you are using a lining fabric, is that it will rip on the straight and the cross grain. So we can just take it and rip it and it's going to rip straight for us. So this is really nice. Now let's talk about getting the perfect length for the lining for the bubble. And this can be a little confusing, so I have some visuals here to help you understand this. So I have my skirt laid out, I've got my tape measure over here at the side. You can see my length is around 20 and a half. And I'm gonna fold this up right where it says 16, just so you can see how much we want to bring that up. Now, I need a lining piece from the bottom of this bubble, but not the very bottom of it, where I have it folded up. So this line right here, all the way up to the waist. So this means if we take a look at the tape measure here, I need about 12.5 inches for my lining. So my lining length is always going to be shorter than the actual length of the outside dress or skirt because the bubble comes up to the inside to meet the lining. And also don't forget about your seam allowance. So if I line this up precisely, it looks like it's at 12. So this means 13. So I'm gonna add a 1/2 inch for the bottom and a 1/2 inch for the top. So my lining length only needs to be 13 inches long. So I have my tape measure at the edge of my fabric, and this would be the top of my waist, and then down, there's 13. So I'm going to put a snip into my fabric, and now I can just rip it, and we're making it shorter. So now I have the rectangle that I need for my lining to create a bubble. And if you don't want to snip and rip your fabric, obviously you can use scissors or use your rotary cutter. And if you have some lining fabric that isn't wide enough or long enough, well, you can always sew a few pieces together. Nobody's going to see this on the outside of your garment. It's going to be hidden on the inside. Next, we're going to finish the edges of the lining. You could zigzag, overcast, or use your serger. This is so it doesn't keep unraveling while you're wearing it and working with it. Now that our lining is cut and the edges are finished, it's time to put it into the skirt. Our first sewing step is going to be placing the lining right sides together, and we're going to sew up the bottom 4 inches. The rest of it we're going to leave open up here if we have a zipper in our garment. If you have an elastic waist, skirt, or dress, you can actually just sew this seam all the way up. And if it's elastic, don't worry, it's still gonna fit because we made it fit our hips and we're just gonna have extra on our waist. I'm using a straight stitch with a stitch length of 2.5. I'm gonna make sure I'm back stitching in the beginning. Coming up that 4 inches. Back stitching again and taking it out. So I sewed up that seam, the 4 inches, and I also ironed my seam open. Next, we're gonna work on bubbling the hem. So we need to gather up the big hem, and then we're gonna end up sewing it into the smaller hem. There's a lot of different ways you could gather something up. You could use basting stitches, you could use a gathering foot. Today, I'm gonna show you a really cool technique for gathering using a zigzag stitch. So we're gonna head over to the sewing machine and we're gonna add this stitch to the entire hem here of the dress. The first step to this method is making sure you have your bobbin thread at the top of your machine here and your top thread. Now I want you to hold your top thread, put your bobbin thread to the back, and you can start wherever you like. I'm gonna line up the edge of my foot with the edge of my fabric for some alignment. And we're going to take our hand wheel and we're gonna pull it towards us 1 full rotation. Down and up. And then pull your top thread and you're gonna get your bobbin thread there to pop up. So there's our bobbin thread and I want you to pull the bobbin thread to the top. And so you can see that our fabric is on the bobbin thread there. So the bobbin thread is coming up through the fabric. Now what I want you to do is pull out enough thread, the circumference of your project. So for me, I'm actually gonna pull out a couple yards of thread just to make sure I've got enough. You're pulling out the bobbin thread and the top thread. Now what we're going to do is take the thread, we're going to hook it to the back of the foot, and we're going to zigzag over these 2 threads. So what we're going to end up doing is creating a channel essentially that's going over these 2 threads, the top thread and the bottom thread there. And it's going to help us gather it up. Now you can make your stitch wider if you're having a hard time catching the 2 threads under the zigzag. And you don't need to pull the 2 threads right now, but you can. So you're gonna notice if you pull the 2 threads, it's going to scrunch up all the fabric. And if you let go of the 2 threads, it'll flatten out. So this zigzag method is really great for being able to adjust your fabric. And there's minimal breakage in the thread, unlike the basting method. My thread just ran out. The nice thing about this method is that if you run out of thread halfway through, you can stop and start again. And I've just ran out of bobbin thread, so I'm gonna put in a new bobbin. So now I've got it all set up again, and I can just continue right where I left off. You don't even need to backstitch if you don't want to. Okay, I'm back to where I started. You can, or not, add a back stitch. And now, let's go take a look at it. So our hem is gathering up with that zigzag stitch. That's creating the little channel for those 2 threads. And the way this works is you can hold those 2 threads and you can gather it up more. You can let it out so that way there's no gather there. And very easily by holding those 2 threads and just cinching, you can gather it up. And I really love this method because it's so sturdy and the threads don't pop. I always feel like the basting stitches pop when you have a lot of fabric together, but the zigzag method, it's a surefire. Now we're gonna grab our lining and we're going to start attaching it. And we wanna place right sides together. And to find a good position, if you left an opening for a zipper, I want you to start there. So I do have an opening for a zipper. So I'm at my center back seam because that's where my zipper is. And I'm gonna line up that seam that I left open, that I sewed up earlier. So I'm going to start there. And now what we need to do is evenly disperse this gather to the lining. So we are going to move around our gathers until we have it positioned right where we like it, essentially. So a lot of times I like to just kind of stretch it out, make it the right size. And now I'm just going to move my gathers around. And if quartering makes sense to you, you can always quarter your garment as well. I do have a few videos on quartering. But I feel like for this method, especially if you're new to this, just making it look even with your eyes and just keeping it organic is also a great way to go. So I'm going to start putting some pins in this. So now I have both layers pinned together. I have the gathered layer pinned to the non-gathered layer, which is our lining layer. Now we're going to sew these two layers together with a regular straight stitch. I'm using a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and this is going to ensure that my stitch is going to be to the left of the zigzag, because we don't want to see those zigzag stitches on the outside of our project. So I'm using a stitch length of 2.5. And I'm gonna work my way all the way around, and I am sewing with the gathers face up. So that way, if I need to move around any of the gathers or straighten them out, I can easily do that. You get back to where you started, overlap your stitches by a few, add your back stitches, and let's take a look. So your skirt should look something like this, where the lining is, it's flat, and on the other side with the gather, it's all gathered up. So I've flipped the lining down, and you can see how the fabric is kind of bubbly here, and it really wants to flip up towards the skirt. Yes, ironing could help, but really what's going to help give this direction is adding an understitch. So we're going to go over to the sewing machine, and what we're going to do is stitch the seam allowance down to the lining. And we're going to do this 1/8 of an inch away from the seam. So I have my seam allowance flipped towards my lining, and I'm sewing super close to the seam, adding that edge stitch so that way it'll hold everything down, keep it nice and flat. You get back to where you started, overlap your stitches by a few, back stitch, and let's take a look. And you can see our beautiful understitch edge stitch right there holding down that lining. It got rid of all of that bubble that was happening in the lining that we didn't want. But you can also see what's happening here and how our skirt hem is starting to bubble. So now what we want to do is take our skirt lining and put it into the inside of the dress. So we are going to flip our dress inside out now. And now that our dress is inside out, we are going to bring our lining layer up to the waist. Here we go. So it should start to look something like that on the inside. You can really see this bubble happening here on the inside of the skirt. And now what we need to do is attach the top of our lining to the waist of your skirt or your dress, whatever it is you have. Since we use a rectangle to do this, the waist on our lining right now is bigger than our actual garment, our dress here. Could be your skirt as well. So what we need to do is pleat this up. And I'm going to suggest that you pleat this, because if you add gathers, it might make it too poofy up here in your waist. But if you want more volume at your waist, then you can totally, same method, add some gathers and then fit it into the waist, and you'll have gathers coming from your waist down as well. But today we're going to be pleating it, which means we're going to be folding the fabric. And it doesn't matter what direction you fold the fabric, but you just need to fold it enough to fit it into the waist of your garment. And we need to make sure we're not skewing it. So like pulling it all over to the back or to the front. And you're going to notice real easy if you are skewing it, because the hem isn't going to lay straight and flat anymore. So I recommend that you start at center back. And since I already had a seam allowance here for my 1/2 inch, I'm folding it under a 1/2 inch. And then I'm going to pin it over here at the waist. And I've got a seam in here. So if you don't have a seam in here, Let's just say you have like a flat waistband for a skirt. You can literally place it over the seam and then start pinning it, and then we'll sew through all the layers. This could be situational depending on the garment and how it's made. But the idea that you want to follow is that we are lining up the layer of the lining to the existing waist of the garment. And these pleats don't have to be even. We just need to pleat up the fabric in the waist and just make sure we're not pulling or skewing the skirt at the bottom. And now I'm going to move on to the front. So I'm just going to flip the whole dress over. And you can already see that it's sizing down to the size of the waist. So we just need to add a few more pleats here in the front. So now I have the entire lining on the front and the back pinned into place. So now I'm ready to sew, and since I had a seam allowance in here, I can just sew the lining to the seam allowance. Anywhere within the seam allowance, you just don't want to go outside of it, otherwise you're going to be altering the dress. But if you don't have a seam allowance to sew to, what you're going to do is be stitching this from the outside of the garment. So if you didn't have that seam allowance, you would take your dress or skirt and you would be sewing the lining down from the outside, and you could choose to do a stitch in the ditch, so sewing right in the seam, keeping it pulled apart, or you could add a little edge stitch or a top stitch to the waist of a bodice or a waistband. But if you are going to be stitching on the outside, that means that you're going to want to pin on the outside. So you'd want to feel for your lining on the back side, double check it, make sure you're catching it, and be pinning on the outside of the garment, so that way you don't have pins hiding on the underside while you're sewing. So if you've got a zipper in a garment, just start down an inch or so away from it so you're not sewing too close to it. You can always go back and hand stitch that little inch. So I'm just going to be sewing 3/8 of an inch away from the waist because the other seam allowance on here is a 1/2 inch and I don't want to risk running into that. We're just going to sew to the end as far as we can until the zipper and the other fabric gets in the way. So I'm just going to sew to there, add a couple back stitches, and let's take a look. So now our waist lining is attached to the existing waist and everything's staying in place. Now, if you do have a zipper, you can hand sew a little bit of this by the zipper and then flip in the lining by the zipper, and you can hand sew it down next to the zipper. But all you really need to do is make sure you're tacking it back at the waist so it doesn't get caught in the zipper. You can actually leave this slit in here in the lining if that's too much for you beyond your skill level. Otherwise, you can just hand sew this down really nice to the bottom of the zipper. So I'm just going to tack this down real quick. So I tacked on the lining using a slip stitch, which you can see there if I pull it back. And if you need to know how to sew a slip stitch, I'll put a link down below in the description. We are finished. Let's turn it right side out, and then we get to try it on and check it out and see our major transformation. But before I try the dress on, I want to go over what you would do if you already had a lining in a dress or a skirt. So let's say we had this gown here and I wanted to make the bottom of this high-low bubble up. Well, the first thing we need to do is take in the lining. So we always want the lining to be slimmer than the outside layer. This is what creates the bubble. Now, the more you slim this inner layer at the bottom, the more it's going to bubble. You just got to remember, you have to be able to move in your hips still, and you got to be able to walk. So just make sure you don't slim it too much. So you can slim the lining, and then because the lining's already in there, we essentially are going to follow the same process of gathering up all the way around the outside layer and sewing it to the lining. But don't forget, the lining needs to be shorter than the outside layer. And generally, you're always going to find that your lining layer is 2 to 4 inches shorter than your outside layer in something because you don't want the lining layer hanging out of the bottom hem. So your lining layer should already be shorter for you. And then to get these two layers to attach together so the gather's on the inside, you're going to have to open up your lining layer somewhere inside of your garment. It could be a side seam, it could be center back, it could be anywhere really. You just need to be able to get to the inside so that way you can sew these two layers together. So in a nutshell, you want to make sure you slim down your lining, make sure it's shorter than the outside layer, and find an opening to get to the inside so that way you can flip it right sides together to gather up the outside to the lining. And here's our new bubble hem. Check this out. This is so different from when we started. We took that long straight hem and we gave it a bubble. And it was so easy to do. All we needed was a piece of lining fabric, some gathering, and a sewing machine, and we did it. The sewing machine is amazing. Transforming a garment by adding a bubble to it is such a great way to change the style to an existing garment you have in your closet, or maybe when you're out thrifting. You like it, but it could be a little more fun. Add a bubble to it. And the bubble skirt is such a fun trend right now to embrace. So next time you see a plain hem, think about giving it a bubble makeover. I would love to know what kind of garment you might have that you would turn into a bubble. Leave that down below in the comments. And I was thinking about doing a video on an adjustable bubble skirt. Let me know if you want to see that down below in the comments. And I'd love to know if you want to see a separate tutorial on adding a bubble to a garment that already has an existing lining. Let me know down below in the comments. Thank you so much for watching Sewing Anastasia today. If you have any questions on this process, let me know down below and I'll get back with you as soon as I can. If you enjoyed the video, make sure you like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you know when all the new tutorials come out. And if you're already a subscriber, thank you so much for watching today. These videos are for you guys. So let me know what else you would like to see. And don't forget, I teach classes here in my design studio in Chicago and online. So make sure you check those out through the links down below. And I also have an online sewing club. So make sure you check that out too. And if you want to know what's going on in the studio right now, well, make sure you check out my Instagram stories. Thank you so much for watching today. Bye!